I'm often not shocked when I go through news headlines, but I was particularly shocked when I went through a court order, the KZN High Court. It's about a man who was wrongfully arrested and spent time behind bars for almost 3 years. SAPS has now had to cop off something like 3.5 million rand to the man who they kept locked up for 2 years and 8 months in a wrongful arrest case. The court found that Mdunyiswa Mtolo was maliciously arrested by police and has been awarded that 3.4 million rand in damages. Dr Nechama Brodie is the coordinator of the Wits Justice Project. Shocked just seeing either gross negligence or in fact malicious intent by SAPS officials in keeping this man behind bars for 2 years and 8 months. What's also quite worrying, Nechama, is that South African police and the Department of Police it's been quite regular for them to be paying large quantums of money for people whose rights they've infringed. But with regards to this particular case, what do we know about Mr. Mtolo's wrongful arrest and for why he was kept behind bars for 2 years and 8 months and not even receiving a fair trial? He's been before a court, I think something like 37 times, and by the end of it, the case simply tossed out.
Good morning, Nick. I think we need to put this in context of a couple of things. Is first of all, that this was a malicious arrest. So here where the police had actually lied about the factors that he was arrested for. But, you say, it was terrible because he was wrongfully imprisoned for nearly 3 years. And when you say that, do you know that a third of our prison population, so currently around 47,000 people in South Africa, are in prison and they haven't yet been found guilty? So these are remand prisoners. Many of them are people who can't meet bail conditions, and we can have a discussion about that depending on time. Sometimes they're people who are denied bail by the courts. And as we see with this case, this man appeared before court 37 times, and we see how the justice system really failed him. So it wasn't only the police that were malicious in their arrest. The justice system, the courts failed to actually spot that there was a problem there. And there's a statute within sort of one of the criminal acts, and all the lawyers listening will have to forgive me because I'm a journalist and an academic, not a lawyer. But that says that remand prisoners shouldn't be kept by the state for more than 2 years. Listen to that, more than 2 years. So we have a whole bunch of people who normally, by default, it's not unusual for people to stay in prison for 2 years without even being convicted of a crime. And I think if we start as that as a point, we see that the problem is so much bigger than just that. Being dishonest in this case, although this is a particularly troubling case, obviously, because you wonder, why would the police officers go to such extreme efforts to lie about somebody?
So if you have a prison population of about 150,000, and quite recently something that Jacob Zuma benefited from was a remission of prisoners program to release people for low sentences and non-violent conduct. The South African Correctional Services actually had to open up prisons because we are overcrowded, in excess of 150,000. But you're saying that a third of that are in fact people who haven't gone or completed the judicial process. They're simply just languishing and waiting for their day in court.
We all have this funny idea that justice happens the same way as the Oscar Pistorius case, that within 3 months you have a trial, it's all done and dusted, and then, the judge kind of gives you a sentence or lets you free, and then it's all fine. But many people don't experience justice that way, and I hope that please include the link on SAFI to this judgment, because the way that the judge describes what happened very simply and describes the conditions of the prison should really give everyone a sense of horror as to the problems that we have with our prison system. We have traditionally one of the largest prison populations in the world per capita. This is a legacy of the apartheid state because we used to use prisons during apartheid to remove black men, particularly from the streets, and often put them into labor situations. But we haven't moved on from that. And when we do put people into prison, put them into the absolutely inhumane conditions, which are described very simply and very clearly in this judgment. And that just gives you a glimpse of how terrible being sent to prison before you've even been found guilty of anything can actually be.
Nechama, if cases are not ready, if they're, in other words, also not winnable, why then is the National Prosecuting Authority signing off on these cases to go to trial if there's something like 47,000 people who are simply awaiting trial in South African jails?
So that's a very good question. I don't know that it's always the NPA. Sometimes I think there are many gaps between how our systems talk to each other. You must remember that the police, SAPS is a different department, a different government department to justice and constitutional development. And they are also a different department to correctional services. And there are always going to be administrative and bureaucratic gaps. But this is an important question we need to ask ourselves as a country, especially around election time. There are politicians who say things like, we need to bring back the death penalty. Now, we have a justice system that can't even arrest somebody properly or let them out on bail when they were, fraudulently charged with something. Is this the kind of system that we want to trust with actually sentencing people to death? The answer should very clearly be no. But in other countries in the Global South, I was recently at a conference listening to scholars from Brazil, also talking about horrendous prison conditions. And people are trying to push for almost no remand prisoners and reduce sentences for many people and trying to think of alternatives to prisons. Because exactly, why do we arrest somebody? We keep them in prison awaiting trial because, well, if we let them go, maybe they will disappear, then we won't find them again. But if our chances of actually successfully prosecuting somebody if they're guilty are very small, why are we holding so many people? The more law enforcement officials I work with across the spectrum, the more I hear the same sentiment repeated over and over again, that it is better that 100 guilty people go free than that one innocent person is found guilty.
This particular gentleman, Mdunyiswa Mtolo, he's being paid 3.4 million rand in damages. In 2021, SAPS paid out 365 million between 2015 and 2020. The claims that SAPS have had to pay to people who've charged him with wrongful arrest is something like 1.5 billion rand. When we're talking about how budgets could be better spent, I could think of so many things where we could have spent 1.5 billion rand instead of keeping people in remand for up to 2 years, Nechama.
So again, this would be a job of there are committees and structures within SAPS that are supposed to give oversight when they perform badly or lie or dishonest or kill somebody in custody and all that sort of stuff. And SAPS wouldn't be the only government department that has negligence claims against it. Let's also know that those claims are, they may be very long term. So it's kind of like if we looked at building a bridge over 10 or 15 years, billions suddenly become a little bit more reasonable. Of course, the money could be better spent elsewhere. But I wanted to point something else out. Do you remember when Mr. Mtolo was arrested? He was arrested in 2011. Okay? 2011. He spent 2 years and 9 months in jail. He was released in 2014. He only got his judgment in 2021, and he's waited nearly another 2 years to have this amount awarded against him. So let's always keep in mind, yes, the money could be spent better, but that money could be an average of 20 years of cases. We don't know necessarily when the cases come from. And there are these people who wait decades for justice. And the idea is we need a lot more transparency. We need a lot more reporting on cases like this because transparency is what is going to force these government departments to be accountable and maybe make other people realize that they also actually have sort of claims against the state or that they have rights that they can insist on. I know South Africans we often discriminate against prisoners or people who are in prison. But what Mr. Mtolo's case shows us so clearly is that somebody can be in prison and not be guilty at all.
Recidivism in South Africa is quite high. A statistic by NICRO, who even admitted then in 2019, this is largely a guesstimate, but recidivism in South Africa is as high as something like 80%. People who have been imprisoned reoffend and find themselves back into the system. But what does it mean for someone who's arrested on a charge and taken in quite young? He spends 12, 18 months awaiting trial and comes out even hardened, more hardened. We talk about our prisons being universities of crime in South Africa. So you in fact have people going in for, one would argue, lesser offences and coming out having not received a trial and simply released and have become more equipped to carry out even hardened crimes. Nechama?
Well, if you read what this judgment says in itself, but also if you go and look online, for example, parliamentary, sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. Parliamentary monitoring groups have regular sort of hearings in Parliament where they ask questions about prison conditions. And those are published for free in full online. So I recommend also anyone who's interested is just to go and Google prisons and South Africa and Parliament and see what is put in front of their discussions around prison conditions. And as you say, prisons being sort of universities for future crime. And when you look at the conditions that are described there, so whether it's sexual assault, you have to, in this judgment itself, it describes how he had to actually pay a fee to prison gangs to avoid being assaulted or to avoid being stabbed or something like that. So if you live in that kind of environment, it's very, very hard to change once you get out of it, even if you're not guilty. And then what the damages in this case are also about were how it damaged his self-esteem, because even though he wasn't guilty, he was arrested in full view of all his co-workers. So everybody assumed that he was guilty, that he'd been sentenced because he'd been in prison for so long. How is somebody supposed to rebuild their lives after that? And I think this is a question that comes up again and again. Why do we have prisons if we are not giving prisoners the chance to rebuild their life afterwards? You know, a prison sentence isn't a death sentence, and it shouldn't be the punishment in and of itself. It shouldn't be a further punishment in and of itself. And I think our societal expectation is almost that all prisoners must somehow have done something bad and they deserve this ill treatment. But we make it so hard for many of them to actually change, to rebuild and to regain a proper life after release. And that just limits the future opportunities of particularly black and coloured men in this country.
Dr Nechama Brodie, Wits Justice Project, appreciate your time.